Right, well, some of you know me already. My background, well, I mean, you'll know me mostly because I'm the History and Theory of Art lecturer on the BA, Fine Art BA at Canterbury Christ Church University. But I've also had perhaps an unusual career path. That I've worked as a street performer, I've worked as a puppeteer, although I'm not sure if those days are behind me or not really. They're kind of on pause at the moment. But something that is ongoing is that I perform in mumming plays and things. You'll say I'm disguised, so you won't know it's me, thank goodness for that. But some of that mumming plays, we'll come back to that later on, shall we? We'll hold that thought. And some of that has kind of accidentally entered something in this lecture. When I was asked to do this lecture before Christmas, I thought, okay, that's fairly straightforward. I'll do it, it's like the first one. So I said, well, I won't do a performance lecture, I'll just do a straight lecture. And I've already got a lecture, because I do chants and the Readymade for my undergraduate students. Okay, easy, sorted. And then, of course, discover, oh, it's a performance lecture, and went down on the billing as a performance lecture, I'll have to think about that. And it was a 2-hour lecture I had, and then, oh, I'm doing 1 hour, so that's fine, I can squeeze, oh no, hang on, you try and squeeze these two halves together, they don't match, do they? So you'll see I've crossed out chants and, yeah? And I thought, it's a Dada lecture, so I'm allowed to do things like that. Chants can be the kind of present absent, yes. They will in a moment, yes. They're on for a reason. You could just about make it out. Yeah, here through the haze. It does say chants and the Readymade. But I was just before I start, I thought I should say something about chants, although I've removed it from the lecture itself. And what I want to say about chants is that it's worth remembering the time when the Dada movement was born. It was born in the middle of the First World War. A group of artists, writers, musicians got together in a dirty little back room called the Cabaret Voltaire, like the back room of a pub. And they met there regularly, and I suppose they fled from various, war-torn Europe, various places. They didn't want to be involved in the war, some of them were pacifists. And I suppose, everything was collapsing around them. Switzerland was neutral, so they were untouched in that way. But they saw their homelands being just kind of ripped to shreds. And the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, in the 19th century, his very famous maxim, God is dead, seemed to be kind of confirmed by this kind of horrible truth. So what did they have left? What did they have to turn to? There was no higher authority in their world than chance, the kind of randomness of life, and the meaninglessness of everything that was around them. So chance, you could say, became a kind of anti-deity for the Dadaists, an anti-god. So we can't, although I've crossed it out, you see I haven't taken it out entirely, because it's always there, it's hovering in the background somewhere, and it's in the lecture somewhere. You have to work out the kind of hidden presence of chance in the lecture. So the first thing I'm going to kind of point at is this thing that's just appeared in the gallery. Anyone know what this is? Any guesses? What do you think this thing is? Some of you have seen it in my office. Bottle rack? Any other suggestions?
It's not signed by usual.
It's not signed, no. So some of you recognise things. Could it be anything else? What does it evoke?
Torture.
An instrument of torture? I've always felt that actually, that it's like something from a medieval dungeon.
Very small wellies.
You kind of, sorry?
Got very small wellies on them. A welly rack.
It could be a welly rack. Yeah, you could use it for drying other things other than bottles. In fact, I thought I'd return it to its original function, just in case you're really, that's what that bottle rack. Now it's a bottle rack. Yeah, it's regained its function. For a moment, we kind of lost sight of what it was. It's in an art gallery. So it might be something else. In fact, what it's suggesting is all sorts of other things, perhaps other than bottle rack, like a medieval torture instrument. It's like an inside-out Iron Maiden or something like that. Of course, I I can believe, I mean, I put the bottle rack around it. If I put the bottle rack there, it might have other suggestions, which I think the Dadaists would perhaps sort of appreciate. I mean, we could also, perhaps do something like that as well. There we are. It's now a bottle rack cookbook. So it can be whatever you want it to be, really. And I think this is starting to get towards Duchamp's point. And if we can have the lights down, we'll look at some slides. Oh, here you see it in use in a French catalogue in 1912. You can pick these things up. I mean, these things were more common in the early 20th century than they are now. So he bought it, he found it, he bought it, and in 1914 he also inscribed it, he signed it. But then, I mean, he was living in Paris at the time. In 1915 he left Paris for the United States, and the bottle rack and many other objects that were in his studio just got thrown away. They just got discarded. He cleared his studio and got on I don't know if he got on a plane or a boat, to be honest, but he went to New York. In New York, he started realising the potential for these objects. That there was perhaps something, in Paris he wasn't exhibiting them. They were just kind of amusements that were hanging around his studio. And we see one of them here. He actually had to go about, because he'd thrown them all away, when he was in New York, and when he came back to Paris later on, he had to go about acquiring them all over again. Sometimes from France, sometimes he'd try to acquire things in the United States. He started finding other objects in the United States that interested him. This particular one, he found, well, at least he inscribed it in 1960. And it actually says, if you kind of translate what it says in French there, it translates as impossible to recall the original wording, M.D. Duchamp, 1960. And it was a present for Robert Rauschenberg. So it's, there was original wording, we don't know what it was. Maybe that was the original wording, who knows? He's kind of playful like that. His first Readymade, I should also say before we move on, you'll notice, what's the difference between his Readymade and my Readymade?
Good. So,
As we're... His has, yeah. So I'm going to say, in very childish, Dadaist kind of manner, mine's bigger than his. We'll leave it at that. This was apparently his first, well, he claimed this was his first Readymade. So this was the first thing he put these two things together, the bicycle wheel and the kitchen stool. And we see it in photographs of his Parisian studio kind of sitting in the corner. So in one swoop, he invented what we now call the Readymade, and actually he invented kinetic art as well. Because what he'd do in his studio, he would just spin it and stare longingly at it. And he'd talk about it in interviews, that he wasn't trying, in putting this together, he wasn't trying to challenge the art establishment, he wasn't trying to kind of overthrow sort of the sculpture of the time. He was just amused by the movement that it gave. And you can imagine, what happens when you spin a bicycle wheel. At a certain speed, it looks like it's spinning backwards. You get this interesting effect, don't you, where it actually, at certain points and certain speeds in spinning, it looks like almost a solid object, sort of transparent, solid object. So he was just amused by this. I should say he was the laziest artist in the 20th century. And I can imagine, his output was actually quite small for a very long career. And at one point, he seemed to almost give up sort of any kind of art practice for years and years and years, while he became a chess grand master, which is interesting in itself. But I can imagine him sitting there not doing an awful lot of painting at that time and just spinning, staring at the wheel. So, the origin of kinetic art. It was actually when he got to New York that he adopted this term Readymade for these objects that he'd left behind in Paris. And the term Readymade came from the 19th century English clothing industry, and we probably still kind of use this term. Ready-made comes from, with the difference between tailored clothing and something you just pick off the shelf. So most of what you find in clothes shops in Canterbury High Street is ready-mades. It's almost entirely ready-mades. The only time we buy tailored clothing is when we're going to a wedding, pretty much, and we get something fitted. So this is the distinction he was drawing. The ready-made is an off-the-shelf. It exists already. And I think in terms of how this metaphor works, it may or may not fit you. Yeah? It's kind of, there's an element of chance in whether the ready-made off-the-shelf is exactly your fit, or whether you're going to have it adjusted. So that's the important thing, it's tailored. And this kind of thing was obviously, this kind of metaphor was obviously in his mind before he went to New York. Some of the paintings from the Paris period look a bit like kind of abstracted shop tailor's dummies. We see line stitches. It looks like it could be a tailor's pattern that's been kind of folded and folded back on itself. Yeah? So the passage of Virgin to Bride. There's other meanings in this which perhaps I won't go into just yet, but we see these things coming through. And he said when he got to New York in 1950, he said in a later interview, the word ready-made thrust itself on me then. It seemed perfect for these things that weren't works of art, that weren't sketches, and to which no art terms apply. That's why I was tempted to make them. And when I first read that statement, which was about 10 or so years ago, it completely changed my view of Duchamp. As a lecturer then, I had quite a traditional view of art, didn't have much time for Dadaism or anything that followed. And I sort of suddenly realised with that statement that the very reasons that I didn't like ready-mades, that I didn't like this kind of what I considered conceptual art, was the very reasons that Duchamp was making them. It was actually, I was kind of undecided, saying, well, that's not art. And Duchamp saying, no, it's not art, is it? And that's the clever thing. In that it may not be art, but it functions like art. So, you know, we can say, okay, it's just a bottle rack, we might dry our bottles on it, but it might provoke a certain kind of response in a certain context. And that's the important thing about it. So all the way through, you sort of say, no, it's not a work of art. I'm not saying it's a work of art, I'm putting it in an art gallery, but it does the same job. And I thought that, you know, that's his insight. I started thinking maybe he's actually the genius of the 20th century, but he didn't believe in genius, so maybe I can't say that. We'll go back into that a bit more, I think, because it starts to kind of perhaps challenge and make you think about what does an art object do? What does a work of art do? What is its function? If you can suddenly take any object and say, well, it functions like a work of art, it attracts meaning or provokes meaning like a work of art does, is that part, that has a lot to do with the purpose of the work of art. The first time he displayed his ready-mades in a small gallery in New York, they were unlabelled. He placed them in the kind of the entrance area. So you imagine if it was the Sidney Cooper Gallery, they'd be out there, just either side of the entrance as you came in. And no one noticed them. They didn't recognise them as art because they weren't art. We don't even know which ones they were. But they walked straight past them. Perhaps he should have put them right in the middle of the room. However, it wasn't long after that that this business appeared, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the famous fountain. That's probably not, well, that's not the original fountain, that's one of the later kind of replicas. Because the first version was lost, I'll explain the story of how the first version was lost. Marcel Duchamp was on the New York Independence Committee. It was one of these kind of contemporary hanging committees, yeah? So they were putting together an exhibition, and they opened up, call to artists. Duchamp submitted a urinal, turned on its side, and labelled it Fountain. And he signed it, as you see, Armat, 1917. This is, in fact, a photograph of the original. And it looks like, I don't know what you think, but it looks like there's kind of water bubbling up in the top of it, as if it's actually a real fountain. It was photographed by his friend Alfred Seidlitz, who I don't know whether he manipulated it or whether they actually had water running through the thing. Anyway, he submitted it for exhibition, so he was actually on the committee, so he was making decisions about what went into the exhibition. The committee rejected the work. Obviously, you can see him as this kind of lone voice. No, I think this one's quite good. No, it's a urinal. They threw it away. They actually stuffed it behind the back of one of these kind of exhibition boards, and it was never seen again. So the original urinal was lost, the original fountain. Although it doesn't make sense, does it, to talk about the fountain as an original. There's loads of these things in contemporary art galleries around the world. So there's one in the Tate Modern, there's one in fact, Alan told me earlier, didn't you, that until 2008 that was the only piece of ceramics in the Tate Modern, which is an interesting collection. That was interesting, thank you, Alan. I might keep inserting that into lectures. But yeah, Museum of Modern Art have another replica. Some of these replicas were manufactured, especially for purpose. Some of them they actually hunted down the same model of urinal. But yeah, of course it doesn't make sense to talk about the original because he's just picked up a mass-produced object. It's just one. I suppose the photographs are also mass-produced objects. We can't talk about the original when we talk about a photographic print, and Walter Benjamin eloquently talked about that. And there's I think there's something similar going on here in terms of its relationship with originality. So he signed it R. Mutt. Does anyone know who R. Mutt is or was? No one knows. R. Mutt was a manufacturer of urinals. So the company R. Mutt in Paris is the author of the work, is the artist of, So the original, so he signed it, the original creator of the work. Yeah? So who is this? So you get this kind of, so you do have a kind of an original, who makes these things? Oh, someone makes object. Everything in the world is made by someone. It's come off a factory line perhaps, but there's a process there. And there's a design process behind that as well. So, and this has become a favourite theme in postmodernism, this notion that authorship doesn't just belong to, for example, the artist exhibiting. There's often a chain of authorship behind the artist's work, which we might call sometimes appropriation, or we might call influence, a much softer word than appropriation. But in this case, it's him he's taken a urinal, a bit designed perhaps, or at least sold by R. Mutt and presented it. Let's say they threw it away, but we probably wouldn't, that probably would have disappeared in the annals of history. It wouldn't be such a seminal moment if he hadn't published a defence for it anonymously. He never admitted to this defence. He never admitted that he actually published this. But some art historians have kind of have studied what he said in the defence and compared it to other writings, and it matches quite well his comments at the time. So it's pretty certain that it was actually his words. And what he said was, and this was in a journal, only had 2 issues, The Blind Man of 1917, but from there it went, viral. In 1917 terms, viral. Whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so its useful significance disappeared, under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. And so it's creating a new thought for that object, yeah? It has one life in one context, and you can think, there's a joke here, isn't there? If you haven't got the joke already. Here is a fountain. Its original purpose, it's not a fountain, but a fountain goes into it. Yeah? You know what urinals are for. So he's kind of reversed the process. He's flipped it on its side, he's flipped the function round. So the function, water now comes out of it rather than our water's going into it. He said about it in, again, an interview in the 1960s, my fountain was not a no, because it was from a challenge, was this a kind of, negative, this was an attack on, a very Dadaist kind of nihilistic attack on the art world. And he said, no, it's not a no. In fact, he kind of tried to separate himself from Dadaism altogether at that point. I was only trying to create a new idea for an object which everyone thought they knew. Everything can be something else, and that is what I wanted to prove. So we have objects which have one life, put them in a different context, and you're transforming their meaning. They become something else in that context. They undergo transformation, and embedded in a lot of Duchamp's sort of early paintings are kind of alchemical symbolism. The art historian John Golding has done a lot of good work on kind of uncovering some of the alchemical symbolism. And what happens in alchemy, you have raw matter, often lead, which is transformed into something precious like gold. And what do we do in art, in sculpture? We take raw materials and we manipulate those raw materials. And out of those raw materials we create something precious, something which has value. The materials may have absolutely no value at all, but the end product has a value. It has a value on the art market, it has a cultural value as well. And I think this is part of what he was kind of trying to demonstrate. It kind of doesn't matter what the raw materials are, but one can transform the value of the thing. And the meaning of the thing. And of course we see the influence of things like this on Picasso in the 1940s started using found objects. So his head of a ball, Metamorphosis, he talks in very similar terms to Duchamp, and he says, out of the handlebars and bicycle seats I made a bull's head, which everyone recognised as a bull's head. Thus a metamorphosis was completed. And now I would like to see another metamorphosis take place in the opposite direction. Suppose my bull's head is thrown down on a scrap heap. Perhaps someday a fellow will come along and say, why, there's something that would come in very handy for the handlebars of my bicycle. So a double metamorphosis would have been achieved. So you have the metamorphosis into a bull's head, throw out the scrap heap, you have a metamorphosis back into a bicycle again, potentially. Or it just becomes scrap. It becomes matter again. It just becomes material. It is neither bicycle. You detach these parts from the bicycle, it's neither bicycle nor bull's head. This kind of, joining of objects to make something else, to create this other meaning. The New York Dadaists referred to as the assisted ready-made. You say, looking at the Duchamp slides I've shown you, of course some of those are assisted ready-made. So the fountain is, because it's been placed on sign and it's signed. The bicycle wheel is, two objects combined. I suppose the bottle rack is because, again, it's signed. This one is not assisted. Well, it is now, but it wasn't when you first saw it, when you came through the door. So the assisted ready-made was, this term was coined by Man Ray, who was very close to Picasso, and also was exhibiting with Duchamp in New York. So this is one of his perhaps more celebrated pieces, which is actually in the Tate Modern, The Gift of 1921. And so he's combining two objects, the nails and the iron. If you didn't know it was Man Ray, I kind of want to guess, I guess that it was perhaps a feminist artist. I can kind of imagine why one would make an object like this thinking, he's left me with all the ironing again. I'm going to iron his shirt with this, there is something perhaps a little sinister about this combination. It's perhaps no surprise that Man Ray, enthusiastically signed up to the Surrealist group when the Surrealist group was formed. Duchamp didn't join the group. But many of the Dadaists did join the Surrealist group. And this assisted ready-made, he felt this kind of particular juxtaposition would give them, perhaps disturbing or unsettling associations, that just simple juxtapositions would actually speak of perhaps unconscious content. So the gift. I'd like to give that as a gift. That's something else, isn't it? And here's another one of Man Ray's ready-mades. Although this one, The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, was actually constructed just for the photograph. So, like Man Ray, he considered these things, like Duchamp, he considered these things to be ephemeral. They were built for a moment, they were kind of acquired in a moment. There was kind of an encounter with the object at a particular moment. And so he constructed this thing for the photograph and then dismantled it, and goodness knows what happened to the pieces. So this is his photograph. It's a sewing machine underneath an army blanket, sort of wrapped up with string. So what are the suggestions with something like this? You've got a form, mysterious form. It's like a present that's wrapped up. But what's inside this present, without kind of knowing the background to it, it's kind of a game, or almost trying to work out what the hidden object is. Of course, in works of art, we're always looking for hidden meanings. Works of art, James Elkins, the art historian, wrote a book called Why Are Pictures Puzzles? Something like that. Or Why Our Pictures Are Puzzles. And this is that we approach art very often as a kind of puzzle that we need to untangle. We need to kind of work out what the kind of secret is in it. Of course, here the secret in the work is very tangible. It's a physical object. That's what the secret is. But because it's only a photograph, you don't actually have access to that. You don't have access to the key to it. However, it doesn't stop art museums trying to reconstruct it more or less successfully. I'm not sure how successful I think the Tate Modern's reconstruction is. We think, what are the suggestions? I mean, there's that kind of suggestion, which I think this business of hiding things, the kind of a secret, it's like a present. Influenced artists like Christo, wrapping up buildings, large-scale wrapping of things. But we have this notion of domestic industry, the domestic object, and of course remember the iron also was a domestic object, combined with an army blanket, something about the military. So these interesting juxtapositions of things that are considered women's work with something that's considered the realm of men. So muddling up the kind of gender categories, that was going on. And of course that was kind of interesting to the Surrealists. And this kind of thing was the kind of birth, in some ways, of the Surrealist object. Salvador Dali defined the Surrealist object, and part of it came from what the Dadaists were doing. But also there's a clue in the name here, the enigma of Isidore de Cassis. Isidore de Cassis was read by Dadaists and Surrealists. He was a poet who did quite unpleasant, sadistic poems. And very sort of famous line was often quoted by Surrealists, which is the beauty of the chance meeting of a sewing machine and an umbrella on the table of an operating theatre. And it's that, what is that all about? This kind of, these odd objects kind of encounter one another on an operating theatre. What are they going to do to one another? There's something kind of sinister in that. And that was, of course, the inspiration for the sewing machine, being one of the objects in de Cassis' poem. Now, for Duchamp, the work of art, he said, was a machine for producing meanings. That's an interesting definition of the work of art, a machine for producing meanings. So it's not necessarily a beautifully sculpted object. It's not to do with, kind of, if you look in the Oxford Dictionary of Art, the Oxford Dictionary, it talks about, the word art means something made with skill, something made with aptitude, an artifact, or something made with artistry. But Duchamp is saying something a little different. It's a machine for producing meanings. And of course, anything can produce meanings in the right context. We look at a bottle rack on a plinth or on two tables, but maybe the tables have a meaning that we could interpret. We look in the stars and see points of light and interpret those stars, of course, as objects, as animals, as people. It's like everywhere we look, we're kind of interpreting things, we're looking for meaning. So a machine for producing meanings. And he said, all in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act. So the artist has one job in creating the work, or in this case, simply curating rather than creating, selecting the work for display. And then the spectator, the viewer, has another job in working out the meaning. And you can see how this, of course, had enormous impact on later thinkers, postmodern thinkers, and also what's called the institutional theory of art. So in the 1970s, George Dickey formulated this theory of art as a kind of replacement for formalist theories of art and expressionist theories of art and so on. The institutional theory of art is essentially, in a nutshell, that the meaning or the definition of something as art depends on its context. So if you place something in a gallery, it can miraculously become art. And similarly, objects become artifacts rather than just functional objects or the product of human labour if you put them in a museum. So you put an object that we just use every day, I don't know, a projector, a chair, thing like that, you put it in a museum, suddenly we start looking at it in terms of the design, the style, the kind of process behind it, all of those things. We mark it out for attention because of the context. So that was his point. You're joking. Really? Right. So we'll do a quick experiment here, which is we've got clips in the middle of the room. So 30 seconds, some kind of object, a small object. We have a glass, a wine glass. We put it in our gallery, start reading meaning into it. All of a sudden, we have this magical thing. Piero Manzoni, the Italian artist, exhibited what are called magic bases, invited people to put things like that on the base. You can see that, obviously, as an inspiration for Anthony Gormley's the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, where people would stand for, as it says here, a period of time, for an hour at a time. And of course, do they become a work of art because they're on a plinth? They certainly become a point of attention. This is Piero Manzoni putting a plinth upside down. It's plinth of the world, homage to Galileo. Galileo turned our idea of the universe upside down. What if you put the world on a plinth? So it's not just an upside down plinth. The entire world is suddenly a work of art. Everything in it is now a work of art, because Manzoni has done that. This, of course, you've got this kind of idea you can kind of stretch and stretch and stretch. So Cornelis, Giannis Cornelis, who was one of the Arte Povera artists, another Italian, in 1969 exhibited 12 horses in a gallery. Live horses, a lot of work to clear up after them. Suddenly we're not looking at art as representation anymore. This is the real thing. So rather than being a representation of the real, this is the real. This is the thing. So the work of art, the representation, gets replaced by the real. Germano Salant, who was kind of one of the theorists for the Arte Povera movement, said that this, and he defended the movement, said this is the end of art, this is the death of art. That art, as we have understood it, no longer kind of makes sense when you start doing things like this. These are not works of art, as Duchamp would have recognised. But they take the place of a work of art. They attract meaning. We start to think, why 12 horses? What is it about the horse? Does the horse symbolise something? Is there something about horses that's important here? I'm going to eat into my question time. It's the death of art, but for Salant it was the birth of a new relationship with reality. Reality becomes art, art becomes reality. So you have this kind of, anything out there in the world has the potential to become art. And Duchamp, I'm starting to wind up, honestly. Duchamp would have these encounters with objects. We'll come back to Duchamp for a moment. So when he was in New York, he encountered this, the snow shovel. They didn't have snow shovels in Paris at that time. You'd never seen one before. Weird, over-large shovel. What do you do with it? It's a strange thing. He started exhibiting these snow shovels, and he'd often suspend them from the ceiling, so it loses its function. He called it In Advance of the Broken Arm. He loved his kind of wordplay games. In fact, words for him were kind of ready-made materials as well. So, is it the broken arm of the shovel, if you're shoveling too hard? Is it your broken arm? You know, you can break arms with snow shovels, apparently. So there is that kind of playful thing about function and technology in this. You know, it has a function while it's a snow shovel. It ceases to have that function either when it becomes exhibited in the gallery or if it has a broken arm, one or the other. Yeah? And then when it's got the broken arm, suddenly what is it? It's just wood and metal. It's no longer anything really. It ceases to have that kind of identity. And the philosopher, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, described art as purposefulness without purpose. I think this is, it says a lot about functionality. It has a purpose because you've got to put it in an art gallery and present it to people. There is intention behind it, but it doesn't have a kind of pragmatic purpose. It doesn't have a function. Similarly, Oscar Wilde said all art is quite useless, saying quite exactly the same thing, but in a very different way. All art is quite useless. And I think there is kind of an acknowledgement in work like this that this is the case. For Kant, the purpose of art was metaphysical. It talked of something outside of the physical, something beyond the kind of immediate. It accrued meaning. That was what it was about, essentially. In the winter following 1945, there was a lot of snow in the Museum of Minnesota, and the snow shovel was actually used by the caretaker to shovel snow, thus damaging the inscription. The snow shovel was fine at the end of it, but obviously its function as a work of art suddenly was kind of eradicated by its use as a snow shovel again. And of course you get the double metamorphosis that Picasso was talking about. And this leads me on to other kinds of, the last thing I want to talk about is objects like brooms. So an artist like Joseph Beuys, who was very influenced by what Duchamp had been doing much earlier in the century, exhibited objects like this silver broom and broom without bristles. So he's thinking about the functionality of objects, but also, these are objects that have been manufactured as works of art. You could sweep up with them, actually, but they tend not to be used for that. So he's also thinking about this relationship between technology and art, usefulness, and you put it in an art gallery, it suddenly becomes something valuable. Or you make something, but here he's made something valuable out of it. For Beuys, of course, Beuys thought a lot about the symbolic nature of the materials themselves. So, there's copper there, copper's a conductor, silver reflects light and protects the wooden broom within it, and that's where we might start to look for meaning. But he also performed actions with them. He would sweep. So this is him sweeping with his students through the woods. They're using birch brooms, they're kind of clearing a path. And these were woods that were being sort of threatened with removal and flattening for tennis courts. So this is activism. It's kind of ecological activism. It was also for him a kind of art action, because he didn't really distinguish between what's an art action, what's a political action. But these are all kind of the same activity for him. He saw a particular role for the artist, whereby anyone could be an artist. Everyone could be an artist. That was what he proposed. And in a sense, you can see how he's kind of drawn that idea from Duchamp. And he said very specifically that even the street sweeper, if they're sweeping in a certain kind of way, with a certain kind of perhaps awareness of what they're doing, are potentially an artist. And you see this object in the corner of the room, which is a broom. Did anyone think it was a work of art? You didn't, did you? No, it's not really, is it? But it could be. But also, something that they're doing, obviously they're sweeping, so they're kind of sweeping like this. And it's an action which is kind of an interesting action, isn't it? You're cleaning, you're sweeping. And there's a line in Tristan Zara's Dada Manifesto of 1918, which is we must perform, it's something along the lines of we must perform this great work of destruction. We must sweep and clean. So it's the metaphor for kind of cleaning. That's what Dada was about. Dada is about what the broom does, which is cleans. Yeah? Sweeping away the old and creating a kind of new relationship with reality, with the object. And with the object that's sweeping, of course, in this case. It's a gesture that we find elsewhere as well, though. And I wonder if this was at the back of Joseph Boyce's mind. We can't tell. You find sweeping actions like this in folk theatre. So you find it in mumming plays, which is kind of British folk theatre. We find mumming plays in Germany as well, where Joseph Boyce is from. In Kent, we actually find the sweeping action in what's called the Hood and Horse play. I wasn't going to talk about Hood and Horses at all, and then, quite by chance, an image of a Hood and Horse went up on advertising this talk online. Because that's one of my research interests, and it's kind of obviously a confusion about what I was going to talk about. So I thought, oh hell, we're talking about brooms, you get sweeping. So what happens in the Hood and Horse play is there's sweeping that goes on before the Hood and Horse comes on. So you sweep at the audience, and you kind of sweep them out the way. I try really hard not to sweep that. And then the horse itself comes on. So you clear this, you kind of symbolically clear the space. And then you kind of have this funny object that appears, which scares people actually. And it looks a little like this. So, this is how to make a Hood and Horse using a broom and a bit of Hessian sackcloth. It's a certain kind of, it's an animal disguise. There are animal disguises across Europe. And a lot of them are constructed in the same way, where you've got a pole, and you've got a head on the top of the pole. And you disguise yourself, if that's going to stay on, underneath, like that. And you've suddenly got a horse, yeah? You've got a horse. Yeah, is that a horse? Can you give him sound effects? Yeah. And some name, please. And if we go like that, it's a rearing horse. Yeah? If we go like that, he's standing. So that's how to make a Hood and Horse at home. I'm finishing now. Not quite, because I've got one last punchline. You're going to let me get to the punchline, which is, if we go like that, now what is it? If I go and go like that, it's a galloping horse. It's a hobby horse. Now, my students who were looking at the Dada Manifesto, 1918 Manifesto, what is a hobby horse in Russian and Romanian? Dada! Dada!